The article for my review is entitled "The Jews in the Sugar Industry of Colonial Brazil," and it was written by Dr. Arnold Wisnitzer and published in 1956 in a scholarly periodical entitled Jewish Social Studies, which is a quarterly journal currently published by Indiana University Press and has been in publication since 1939. Therefore, the audience for this article would primarily be historians and sociologists and not so much the general public. For such a short article and a relatively narrow subject, it is extensively documented with both primary and secondary sources. The author, Dr. Arnold Wisnitzer, is an intriguing character, and I wish I could find out more about him. The photo we see is from a visa he used to escape with his wife and young son from Nazi-occupied France in 1939. It isn't clear what his original nationality was, but it is known that he was fluent in English, Portuguese, Hebrew, German, Spanish, and Dutch. So not only is it anybody's guess where he came from originally, but it seems he was also pretty uniquely and very well prepared to do the research on matters in colonial Brazil. I put the name of Aristides de Sousa Mendes up here because I think this part of Dr. Wisnitzer's personal story is worth mentioning. De Sousa Mendes was the Portuguese consul in Bordeaux, France at the time of the Nazi occupation, and he issued thousands of visas to Jewish refugees in defiance of his own government's orders, enabling them to escape the Nazis through Lisbon, where many of them fled to Brazil, and also at the same time bringing financial and social ruin upon himself and his family, as the Nazi sympathetic Portuguese government punished him severely for his acts of humanity. Regarding his actions, he made the statement, "I would rather stand with God against man than with man against God." Not only are such acts of character and heroism worth remembering, but this story ties in well with the history we are talking about here, because the same thing was going on in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Jews fleeing from the Iberian Peninsula in order to escape persecution. It is interesting to speculate how much this experience influenced Dr. Wisnitzer's later research into the Jewish experience in colonial Brazil, but he does seem uniquely qualified to study such things, and my impressions of the article are that it is well researched and written and is an excellent source for information on the subject. So the historical scope of the article ranges from 1420, when Portugal first transplanted sugarcane from Sicily to Madeira, all the way up to 1774, when the laws discriminating against new Christians were abolished. Through the use of his primary and secondary sources, the author provides evidence for the participation of Jews, both new Christians and Marranos, or Jews suspected of still being practicing, in the sugar industry, primarily as managers, merchants, and owners of sugar plantations. There are many sources cited in this article, and I won't try to document them all here, but if anyone is interested, I think the article is worth a read, if for nothing else, to see how an author can really take a very narrow subject and focus on it, and provide an extensive set of evidence to support their thesis. Two of the main secondary sources are shown here, and just to provide an example of the types of publications the author utilized. He used these two particular books to establish that Jews were involved with the sugar industry at least by 1493 on the islands off the west coast of Africa, and that they were a part of the progression of the industry from those islands to colonial Brazil. His primary sources are primarily records of the Inquisition, which we already know are extensive. He also uses a letter to the King of Portugal written in 1556 that mentions a new Christian named Fernandez as owner of a sugar mill. The Inquisition documents concern the investigations and trials of New Christians suspected of being Marranos, and the occupations were listed. Many of them turned out to be señores de engaño, or owners of sugar plantations and mills. The author feels that it is clear that despite these persecutions, that not all New Christians in the sugar industry found themselves at the mercy of the Inquisition. So the actual numbers of Jews in the business were probably much larger. Their success and wealth no doubt made them easy targets, as basically all New Christians were potentially suspected of being Marranos. So how does all this connect with what we are studying in this chapter? Well, the Restall Lane text on pages 218 to 220 discusses how New Christians, particularly Portuguese, were singled out for investigation by the Inquisition, and how many were deprived of their property as a result. The same section also goes on to discuss how popular tolerance for New Christians and even Marranos persisted despite the policies of the Inquisition. The plain and simple fact is that the sugar industry was vital to the Brazilian economy, and a sugar plantation and mill required a lot of skill and knowledge to run successfully. So turning the entire industry on its head by persecuting some of its most experienced operators was not such a popular idea. So this whole story of how officially Jews did not exist in society, and if they did, they were branded as heretics, yet the reality of how Jews, both those that professed Catholicism and those who still practiced, were very much an important and significant part of society, gives us some additional insight into how orthodoxy and deviancy played out in colonial Latin America. So to conclude, I would say that I was impressed with the author's qualifications, and I found evidence in other articles on JSTOR that he is indeed very well regarded as an authority on his subject. The article is well written and very methodical and well organized in the way that the author states and backs up his thesis. His primary and secondary sources are well chosen, and he makes good use of the limited primary sources he has to work with. I thought the article was a great example of how a well-written scholarly article should be, focused and well documented. It was a nice tie-in to this week's material, and I gained some additional insight into the complex relationships that were a part of colonial society, particularly where it concerns the interplay and sometimes conflict between what is official and what is the actual reality. Thanks for viewing my presentation.